titles of Jeff Rubin's last two books say it all, as far as I'm concerned. The first was called Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. And then he followed that up with a second volume, and the title of that is The End of Growth, But Is It All Bad? And what's interesting for me about this posture of decrying our addiction to automobiles and to the suburbs and to our indifference, or at very least confusion, about global warming, and not to mention our grubby materialism, is that the guy who's writing was himself for 20 years a baron of Bay Street. And these are positions that you would normally identify as politically correct, possibly left-wing. So it's interesting that he quit it all to follow his bliss and to blow a whistle on his ex-colleagues who still pursue the goal of growth at any cost. This is Jeff Rubin.
Back in the 1970s, after the first oil shock, President Nixon implemented what was called the Energy Emergency Conservation Act. It lowered the speed limit on interstate highways in the United States to 55 miles an hour, much to the chagrin of American motorists at the time, in an effort to save fuel. But when the price of oil has increased as dramatically as it has over the last 10 years, going from $20 a barrel into triple-digit range, you don't just change the speed at which you drive your car, you change the speed at which your economy can grow. Just like people require food, economies require energy. And the single most important source of energy, and really the only source of energy as a transit fuel, is oil. Because no matter how you move yourself or goods around the world, whether you move it by air, whether you move it by boat, whether you move it by rail, or whether you move it by truck, you're basically burning one fuel and one fuel only, and that fuel is oil. If we know anything about the performance of the global economy over the last 40 years, we know this: feed it cheap oil, and it runs like a charm. But ration it with expensive fuel, and it literally seizes up overnight. Every major global recession that we've seen in the last 40 years has oil's fingerprints all over it. 1973, the first OPEC oil shock. Lo and behold, what quickly followed in its wake was the deepest recession up until that point since World War II. And no later than 6 years later, the second OPEC oil shock that led to not one, but the now infamous double-dip recession. And then in 1990-91, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and left half of its oil fields on fire, and oil spiked to the then unheard-of price of $40 a barrel, lo and behold, once again, all the major oil-consuming economies of the world rolled over into recession. And last, but by no means least, the run-up in oil prices from $30 a barrel to as high as $147 a barrel that ushered in the deepest recession we've yet seen. The one difference between today and the past was, in the past, somebody closed off the spigot, or somebody invaded a major oil-producing economy. Right now, the spigot's wide open. Never has more run through it than runs through it today, some 90 million barrels a day. The only problem is we can't afford what's running through. You see, peak oil isn't about what you can drill. Peak oil is about what you can afford to burn. And there's a big difference between the two concepts. The world's never going to run out of oil in the absolute physical, geological sense. There's about 170 billion barrels of it in the Alberta tar sands alone. There's more in the Orinoco tar sands in Venezuela. The only problem is that the kind of oil prices needed to extract oil from tar or from deep water or from shale translates into oil prices that take millions of drivers off the road. Worse than that, it causes oil economies to keel over and die. Of course, that's not the way that most economists or most financial market pundits would have characterized the last recession. They would have said it was a financial crisis whose roots lie in the now failed U.S. subprime mortgage market. No one has to tell me how devastating the subprime mortgage market was to financial institutions. Why the hell do you think I'm an author now? The bank that I used to be a chief economist of, and many other banks around the world, wrote down some $7 billion in these fancy financial derivative assets called collateralized debt obligations that were chock full of delinquent subprime mortgages. If you're wondering why did risk-averse banks around the world hold this stuff, you got to remember that it came with a AAA wrapping paper. AAA credit rating is the highest rating that credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's or Moody's or Fitch can assign. What my former bank and other banks lost sight of is how rating agencies get paid. Rating agencies don't get paid by the investors who follow their advice. Instead, rating agencies get paid by the very organizations that they're paid to rate. In economics, when we have such an opposition of interest between two parties, we call it a moral hazard problem. In investment banking, we call it shit happens. But you know, what really pricked the subprime mortgage market was not so much credit rating agencies, but rather the rise in interest rates. And all of a sudden, from 2004 to 2006, interest rates went from 1% to 5.5%. Any central banker will tell you your interest rate's a reflection of your inflation rate. And all of a sudden, U.S. inflation exploded. But rarely does anyone ask, why did U.S. inflation all of a sudden go from 1% to 5.5%? And as it turns out, virtually all of the increase in inflation came from one component of the consumer price index, the energy component. And virtually all of that gain came from one price, the price of oil, which went from $30 a barrel, which most oil analysts and economists at the time said it would remain, to $70 a barrel, and then to $147 a barrel. Well, if oil would have stayed at $30 a barrel, I'd imagine that all those good folk in Phoenix and Cleveland would still be in their homes financed by subprime mortgages. And Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers might still be around. And I might still be the chief economist of CIBC, but that's not what happened. Oil had to rise because at $30, $40 a barrel, oil doesn't flow, not from the places that we rely on it today. It's interesting that if we thought that the last recession was a financial crisis, and that if taxpayers all around the world had a gun pointed to their heads and was told that if they didn't shell out literally trillions of dollars to too big to fail financial institutions, that we would suffer a fate worse than the 1929 Depression. Yet only 4 years later, we find the same financial system basically unchanged. And while it's not subprime mortgages that now threatens the system, it's the sovereign default of entire countries like Greece, like Portugal, like Spain. And just as we discovered that you didn't have to be in the U.S. subprime mortgage business to be impacted by the collapse of the subprime mortgage market, we're soon going to discover that you don't have to own a Greek or Spanish bond to be impacted by the default of those countries. Because in today's interconnected and unregulated world of financial markets, everybody owns everybody else's problems. And make no mistake about it, these countries will default because the only way that they can service the enormous amount of debt that they've carried is through economic growth. But the only problem with economic growth is that economic growth requires burning millions and millions of barrels more of oil. And with oil already at triple-digit oil prices, all that debt might as well be denominated in barrels of oil. I think we're discovering that that debt is extremely energy intensive. And that gets back to understanding that the economy's speed limit has changed, because those that we have entrusted the management of our economy to have not recognized that the economy's speed limit has changed. And thus, they keep the accelerator floored, whether it's zero interest rates or whether it's huge budget deficits. Free money and huge budget deficits is not a substitute for $20 a barrel oil. It's not going to make the transition any easier. It's just going to make it more difficult. Yeah, they give us a sudden jolt of energy to our economy, but the costs that they leave behind dwarf the temporary benefits that they give. Zero interest rates just create speculative bubbles like the subprime mortgage market, or the billions just a couple of weeks ago that JP Morgan's proprietary trading desk had to write down, another too big to fail financial institution. And we'll find out that yesterday's bailouts are only today's cutbacks, as we're seeing in places like Greece and Spain today and in other countries in the past. Well, if more stimulus doesn't work and doesn't make sense, what does make sense? What does make sense is learning to use less energy, because the less energy we can use, then the less constraint energy prices are to economic growth. And there are certainly examples around the world that we could all take note of. Just a year ago, Japan got 30% of its power from nuclear stations. Today, over 50 nuclear power generating stations in Japan have been shut down. Japan has literally become nuclear free in the course of a year. And while it has imported more LNG, liquefied natural gas, and coal, what's really made the difference is their program of Setsuten, or energy conservation, turning escalators into stairs, turning down air conditioning. Look at Denmark, a country that has reduced its carbon emissions below its 1990 level compared to Canada, whose emissions are over 30% higher. How has Denmark achieved that? It's achieved that through charging 30 cents per kilowatt hour for power, about 3 times what we would pay here in Toronto, or by adding as much as 180% surcharge on the cost of a car if it were to contain a V8 engine. You know, when I was in Copenhagen, I didn't see thousands of people lined up in front of the Canadian and U.S. embassies looking for exit visas to migrate to energy-abundant countries like North America. Indeed, international surveys show the Danes to be numbering among some of the happiest people in the world. There's a reason why Japan and Denmark took these initiatives. It's not because they are inherently more energy efficient or inherently greener. It's only the capriciousness of nature that determines which countries have been dealt hydrocarbons and which have not. But we can see from the efforts of both the Danes and the Japanese that when circumstances compel us, we can dramatically reduce our energy consumption. We may find a lot of silver linings in a world of much slower economic growth. We may find, for example, that even our seemingly inexorable path to environmental self-destruction will soon run out of fuel. We're not going to emit half of the carbon that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts in the next 20 to 30 years. Not because of any enlightened policies by our leaders. If we couldn't put a price on carbon emissions when our economy was growing and healthy, what chance do we have of putting a price on emissions when our economy is sputtering and going into recession? But fortunately, we won't have to. Because what happens when economies stop growing is they stop combusting oil and coal. Last year, for example, China consumed 3.2 trillion tons of coal. And yet China's coal consumption is expected to double by these climate change modelers. I'd like to ask them where they think China's going to find another 3.2 trillion tons of coal to burn. And even if they do, what cost will it be? Coal was already trading over $100 a ton, which is as expensive as oil trading at $100 a barrel. You know, if we look at what happened in 2009, U.S. carbon emissions fell. Certainly not because of anything Barack Obama did. What scant environmental protection there was in the United States got shifted all the way to the trunk when the U.S. economy sputtered. And certainly nothing that the Senate did, the Waxman-Markey climate change bill, died on the Senate floor, along with a whole number of other environmental initiatives. The reason that U.S. emissions fell in 2009 is U.S. GDP fell in 2009. And the same thing can be said of global emissions. When the Soviet Union fell apart and the Russian economy deindustrialized, Russia's emissions fell by 30%, and Moscow wasn't even targeting emissions at the time. I'll take a slowdown in economic growth over 1,000 Kyoto commitments, because the one thing that we've seen is at any time our economy slows down, our emissions fall. Now, of course, environmentalists will point out that in 2010 and 11, with an economic recovery, emissions quickly rebounded. But what they're not noting, just like our central bankers and our finance ministers, is the speed limit has changed. That rebound in economic growth is propped up by unsustainable policies. History will tell you that neither zero interest rates nor budget deficits is a marriage that will last for very much longer. So stepping back and looking at a slowdown in economic growth, looking at triple-digit oil prices, what does that really tell us? I believe that we can still have the world we want, but only if we're willing to let the world we've known go away. That when we feel triple-digit oil prices, what are we really talking about? We're talking about feeling the boundaries of a finite world. And as I believe, as those boundaries infringe more and more on the kind of growth rates that we can have in our economy, our real adjustment, more than anything else, has to be in our own expectations. Maybe in facing a finite world, our challenge is to recognize that perhaps making do with less is better than always wanting more. Thank you very much.